Amid the morning barks, echoing through the rescue center hallway, one kennel remained quiet at the very end. Arlo, a 4-year-old German shepherd with eyes that seemed to hold an entire winter, lay motionless, scarred by a chain once wrapped around an old tree where he'd been left behind. Many walked past. None stayed long, until the boy arrived. A child born into a world without sound, searching for someone who truly understood. And the moment their eyes met, a story began that no one could have ever imagined. Morning at the Northlake Rescue Center began with the sound of a broom brushing across damp concrete. Light slipped on through the frosted windows, casting a pale shimmer on rows of steel kennels. Echoes of barking filled both sides of the hallway. Many dogs bounced excitedly, tails wagging at the fleeting shadows of passing humans. Some clutched toys in their mouths. Others simply stood still with wide eyes, each one reacting as if every footstep might be the one to change their lives forever. But in kennel number 27, down at the far end, there was no movement. There, curled up tightly with his head turned toward the wall, lay a gaunt figure. Scars stretched across his back, long-healed but unmistakable. His tangled coat was a dull gray, and beneath the cold fluorescent light, his shoulder blades protruded like ridges, pressed upward by shallow breaths that seemed to carry a weight too heavy for a body to hold. On the small tag hanging by the kennel bars, it read Arlo, German Shepherd, 4 years old. They said Arlo was found deep in a patch of forest just outside town. No homes, no trails, only an old tree and a rusted chain wrapped tight around its base. He hadn't moved when the rescue team approached. No whimper, no resistance. Only his eyes opened when the sound of leaves crunching beneath boots broke the silence. And from that moment until now, Arlo had remained still. He's not ready for anyone yet. Lara had once told a couple peering into his kennel. She'd worked at the center for over a decade and had seen all kinds of wounds. But something about Arlo's silence was different. In the early days, they left his food a full arm's length away, careful not to invade his space. He wouldn't touch it immediately. Only after the hallway dimmed, when the lights clicked off and every footstep faded, Arlo would slowly inch forward, approaching the bowl with the caution of someone who'd once mistaken kindness for danger, as if every kibble might turn into a blade. The behavior made some visitors uneasy. Children whispered questions to their parents as they passed. "Mom, what's wrong with this one?" The answers were always vague. He was probably hurt before Honey, but it wasn't aggression that pushed people away. Arlo had never snarled, never lunged, nor was it age. He was only 4. It was his eyes. There was something in them that made people hesitate. A silence so dense it filled the space around him, making hearts beat faster, making footsteps hurry toward brighter, tail-wagging dogs. One day, a young family visited with their 2 children. The little girl, 7, her braids bouncing as she moved, walked up to Arlo's kennel. "Why won't this dog look at me?" she asked. Her mother gently tugged her sleeve and offered a soft smile. "Maybe he's just sleepy. Let's go see the other one. It can do tricks." And just like that, Arlo was left behind again. He lay still, a shadow no one touched. The faint prints of shoes on the cement floor faded slowly, like a memory no one meant to keep. Lara passed by often, sometimes stopping longer than others. She never asked for change, only hoped to see him blink or maybe twitch an ear when the hallway fan turned on. One evening she sat down with his food tray in hand, speaking softly as if to herself. "You know, people always think wounds mean bleeding. But some wounds, no one can see them. They sit in the heart, and they take a very long time to heal. Sometimes a lifetime." Arlo didn't move. But in a fleeting moment, the light hit just right, and his eyes shimmered faintly, like something deep inside flickered. Lara exhaled, barely audible. It's not his body that's broken. It's trust. That sentence, gentle and quiet as it was, floated through the center like a sunbeam catching dust. A few staff members began to notice. Someone adjusted their shift so they could visit Kennel 27 first each morning. Someone else laid down a new blanket in the corner, thick, warm, patterned with little yellow stars. Arlo didn't change much, but they stayed. He still faced the wall, still lay curled in that quiet shell of his. But if one looked closely, they might see his ears were no longer pinned so tightly. He now lay atop the new blanket, even if he'd ignored it at first. And sometimes when the hallway stood empty, the faint rustle of fabric hinted at movement, as if something long buried had begun to stir. It was around that time a stranger stepped through the gates of Northlake wearing a silver-gray coat and carrying the scent of the western woods. They didn't know they'd stop at Kennel 27. Didn't know that a life once forgotten was about to enter their story. But with every slow footstep forward, though no one realized it yet, a new chapter was beginning. One that wouldn't be written in barks, but in patience glances and the long days spent waiting to be understood. Each evening when the rescue center shut its doors, a gentle amber glow slid through the frosted windows like melted wax. The barking softened as though the whole corridor let out a tired sigh and drifted into quiet sleep. In that dusky silence, Kennel 27 stayed still. Arlo remained curled, one eye slightly open, as if guarding a memory no one dared to speak of. Lara often took night shifts. She'd bring a thermos of hot tea and sit against the wall exactly 3 meters from Arlo. She rarely spoke. Some nights, it was just murmurs into the air. Words meant for no one. But on one fog-heavy night, she finally shared something only a few knew. A fragment of Arlo's past, pulled from a phone call nearly 2 years ago. That day we got a call from a hiker up near Northridge Forest Lara had once told a new staff member. He said he heard something, like the clink of a chain in the wind. But when he turned, all he saw was a faint silhouette of a dog beneath a tree. It took the rescue team almost 2 hours to reach the vague coordinates left behind. And there, beneath a leaning oak overlooking a ravine, they found Arlo. A chain looped tightly around the tree trunk. The ground beneath was worn into a shallow bowl, like he'd circled that tree dozens of times, searching for a warmer patch of earth. He hadn't lifted his head when they arrived. But his eyes were open, not bloodshot, not panicked, just hollow, like driftwood soaked in sorrow, dark, waterlogged, and unbearably heavy. We thought he was already gone, Lara recalled. But when I knelt down, when I leaned in close, he turned his face away, very slightly. And that was the only sign he had left to show he was still alive. 3 days. Based on the condition of his body, the age of the footprints, and the dried mud along his back, they estimated that Arlo had been lying there for at least 3 days. Alone in the early winter chill, when nighttime temperatures could drop below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. For 3 days he had no food, no water, only the wind brushing past his ears, scraping over ribs that felt more like twigs than bone, and the scent of cold, damp soil, clinging like the skin of a dead cicada. No one knew who had left Arlo there. The chain was common. Dull silver, the clasp tightened so harshly it left a blood-ringed wound around his neck. Beneath the matted fur, a small scar curved across his left side, an arc that looked like it had come from a blunt object. Not deep, but deep enough that Arlo flinched every time a human hand reached too close. The intake form was short and clinical German Shepherd male approx. 4 years, severely limited response, signs of psychological trauma, not suitable for households with young children. But beyond that, there was nothing. No microchip, no collar, no name left behind. Just a dog, tied up and abandoned on the forest edge like an old belonging someone decided wasn't worth carrying anymore. A young vet once tried to evaluate him, checking pulse eye movement reflexes. But every time they brought Arlo into the room, he simply stood there. He didn't resist, didn't back away, but his body might as well have turned to stone. No one could read those eyes because they didn't reflect the world anymore. They were the eyes of something that had stopped trying to see. As if all that remained in that space were shadows, the sound of wind through trees, and a bottomless quiet. Laura rested her arm across her knee, her voice softening as she spoke. Some say he was a guard dog, or bought by someone who didn't know how to train him. Or worse, used in fighting rings but rejected for being too gentle. But me, I think something else. She glanced toward Kennel 27. Arlo was lying on his side, eyes closed, breath steady. I think Arlo once belonged to someone he loved, someone he gave his whole heart to. And when that person no longer needed him, he didn't know what to do with that love. So he folded in on himself, stayed in that same position, like if he just stayed still long enough, someone might come back for him. There was something in the way Lara spoke that quieted the room. It didn't come from textbooks. It came from hundreds of overnight shifts, from hundreds of silent stares exchanged with souls who, like Arlo, didn't know how to begin again. In Kennel 27, Arlo was still curled up. But this time, his tail had shifted slightly over the soft blanket beneath him. Outside wind threaded through the window seams, carrying the scent of dry grass. It mingled with the warmth of the tea in Lara's hands. No one said anything more. The story had been told. A part of the truth had been touched, but what remained? The dreams Arlo once had the name he used to respond to the first hand that ever stroked his head when he was just a pup. All of it still lay locked away in a memory no one had yet earned the right to reach. And then came the chime of the rescue center gate. A man had appeared standing still beneath the nameplate, his coat flaring lightly in the wind, silver gray against the color of winter. He hadn't stepped inside, not yet. But his eyes were already searching through the steel fencing, toward the far end of the hallway, toward the silent shadow that lay inside. A shadow that was about to be rewritten, not with haste, but through time, stillness, and a decision to stay. That morning the sky hung low and gray, though the clouds held back their rain. The eucalyptus trees surrounding Northlake swayed gently in the early season wind, carrying the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. The glass door slid open automatically as Silas stepped inside. Mud-caked boots, a faded canvas coat with worn shoulders, and a small fabric satchel slung across his chest. He didn't move like someone who was lost. He wasn't scanning the space like someone unsure. He moved slowly, as if he'd already been here 1,000 times in his mind. Lara was on front desk duty. When she noticed the man standing still before the kennel map, she called out with her usual tone, "Looking to adopt? We've got a few really sweet ones. I can show you around." Silas shook his head gently. "I'm not looking for a dog," he said. "I just needed somewhere quiet." Lara didn't press. People came here for reasons that had little to do with dogs. Some came after funerals, some after divorce. Some just needed a place where sounds were real. Barks, tails thumping against metal, not emails or unanswered calls. The rescue center strangely had a way of holding all the pieces people didn't know where else to put. Silas walked the corridor with his hands tucked into his coat pockets. His gaze passed slowly over each kennel. The other dogs did what dogs always do. A Labrador wagged its tail so hard it knocked over its water bowl. A husky threw its head back and howled with joy. A little corgi rolled on its straw bed and grinned up like it knew it was winning hearts. Silas smiled faintly, but he kept walking. At the far end of the hallway, where the light began to fade into a gentle dusk, he stopped. Kennel 27. Still as ever. A breath of silence in a place full of noise. Inside, a frail shape curled tight facing the wall. The posture unchanged, still withdrawn as though nothing outside could possibly concern him. Silas began to turn away. But in that motion, something flickered across his vision, subtle like a leaf brushing the surface of a still pond. He froze. Arlo, still lying there, had opened his eyes. Deep brown. Just a glance, faint, uncertain, but directed at the man standing before his kennel. It lasted only a second. Not a gaze, just a thread of connection. And in that one moment, Silas felt something move inside him, as if someone had whispered his name without making a sound. He crouched down, resting his elbow on his knee. The only thing separating them was the steel grid between. Arlo didn't move again. He returned to his wall, back to the same posture. But Silas remained still, holding on to that glimmer, that moment no one else had seen. Lara stepped up beside him quietly. "That one?" she asked. Nobody's asked about him in a long time. Silas didn't respond right away. He stayed there another minute, then stood, adjusted the strap of his bag, and turned toward her. "Is there paperwork I need to fill out?" His voice was steady, without hesitation. Lara blinked. You want that one?" Silas nodded once. "You sure?" she asked instinctively, the way anyone who's worked long enough in rescue learns to ask. "He needs time, a lot of it. He may never respond, never engage, never—" "I don't need him to do anything," Silas interrupted, his voice low. "I just need him to exist." There was a long silence between them, the kind only a ceiling fan could fill, whirring faintly overhead. Lara opened a drawer and pulled out a form. "Your name, Silas Avery. You ever had a dog before?" Silas looked up. "Yes. One named Boone, 12 years. Did Boone pass?" "Yeah. 4 months ago, out by the woods near the stream where I used to camp." Lara didn't ask anything more. Some stories don't need many words. Silas signed the form, filled in the rest, and accepted the intake file and initial instructions. Lara watched him walk toward the back carrying a collar, softer and lighter than the others. He returned to Kennel 27, unlatched the gate. Arlo remained still. Silas didn't approach. He simply placed the collar down on the ground, right in the center of the kennel. Then he crouched, leaned his back against the wall, and pulled an old wool blanket from his satchel. He unfolded it slowly, carefully folded it in half, and laid it beside him. An unspoken invitation for someone to sit when ready. A faint breeze slipped through the narrow window at the end of the hallway. The collar turned once, catching the light and sending a soft silver reflection across the concrete wall. Arlo didn't move. But Silas didn't rush. He stayed there, like a rock by the roadside, not reaching closer, not pulling away. And in the stillness between them, a fragile thread was quietly tied, not with a name called out, nor with gestures of affection, but through a single fleeting glance and one quiet statement: "I choose him." The old moss-green pickup truck rolled slowly down the dirt road, skirting the edge of town. In the cab, Arlo sat in the back seat, silent, still as stone. Silas didn't turn on the radio, didn't speak. He kept the window cracked just enough for the wind to stream through, curling through Arlo's tangled fur and carrying with it a cool scent. The smell of dry earth, softened wood, and pine needles after rain. Silas's home sat apart from the rest, backed against the forest and facing a patch of wild grass where daisies grew unbothered. It was a small two-story wooden cabin with a wind chime hanging from the front porch made of oxidized copper. Every time the breeze came, it sang a soft, metallic song, like a greeting that had forgotten how to raise its voice. Silas stepped out, said nothing, didn't call. Arlo didn't move. Only when Silas had disappeared through the front door did Arlo slowly step down, each paw placed as though treading on thin ice. He didn't lift his head, didn't sniff the air. He simply followed the fading outline of the man's footprints as though walking into a place long buried in memory. Inside the cabin was simplicity itself. Dark wooden floors, a worn-out fabric sofa, a low bookshelf filled with topographic maps and a few faded photos hung unevenly on the walls. No television, no kitchen aromas, just soft light filtering through the curtains, settling on a gray rug in the middle of the room. Silas didn't say Arlo's name, didn't beckon. He set down his bag, walked to the corner by the window that looked out on the wild grass. And from a wooden drawer, he pulled out an old jacket, thick fabric, frayed collar, faded from time. He spread it on the floor beside a porcelain water bowl and a small wooden dish filled with dry food. Not too much, just enough not to feel forgotten. Then he stepped back, poured himself a glass of water, sat in the chair. He didn't stare, didn't monitor. He simply breathed out, like one does at the end of a long day, not the beginning of something new. Arlo stood in the center of the room, legs stiff. He scanned the space, slowly, not nervously. There were no shouts, no chains, no glaring lights or clipped commands, just the ticking of a clock on the wall and the faint scent of old fabric rising from the jacket. He took one step, then another, closer and closer to the jacket. And then he stopped, lowered himself, carefully curled up beside the water bowl. He didn't eat, didn't drink, but his nose brushed the edge of the sleeve before resting against the floor. Silas said nothing, but his lips pressed together, like someone trying to hold back a feeling that hadn't surfaced in a very long time. The night passed like that. When darkness fell, Silas climbed the stairs. He left the bedroom door ajar. He didn't call, didn't encourage, didn't lock anything. Downstairs, Arlo remained in the same spot, caught between the dim hallway light and the shadows nesting in the corners of the room. At times, the wind slipped through the doorframe, stirring up a soft creak. Arlo opened his eyes, ears twitching, then lowered them again. He didn't seek shelter, didn't cry out. He simply tucked his head deeper into the sleeve, where warmth lingered like a trace of someone who had survived a winter longer than his own. The next morning, Silas woke early, brewed coffee, and set a bowl of hot water on the table. When he came downstairs, the first thing he did was glance toward the corner of the room. Arlo was still there, but this time the wooden dish was half empty. Silas said nothing. No praise, no encouragement. He simply opened the front door, let in the morning wind, and listened as the copper chimes rang out, a soft, breath-like hum easing through the walls. Perhaps in a world addicted to commands and instant responses, asking for nothing at all was the only way for a guarded soul to dare step out of the dark. And this house, where no one was pressured to be cheerful nor expected to answer, had opened just enough space for a dog carrying the silence of the deep woods, and a man who had lost more than he ever spoke of. 3 days passed, and each day looked almost exactly like the one before. Dawn arrived with the wind brushing through pine branches, light spreading gently across the wooden floor like mist over a still stream. Silas rose early, brewed coffee in silence, opened the porch door to let in the breeze, and settled into the low wooden chair by the table. In his hands, a weathered leather notebook and a silver pen dulled by time. Arlo was still there, curled beside the old jacket laid on the rug. He hadn't moved from that spot for 3 days, even though the door was always open, even though soft light from the porch invited him every hour. He stayed curled up, his head resting on the wrinkled sleeve ears, twitching slightly at the sound of birdsong outside the window. But he didn't walk toward the light. Whenever Silas stood walking slowly over to check the water or change out a portion of food, Arlo shifted just a little farther away, not fleeing, not resisting, just retreating ever so slightly, like someone preserving the last unbroken piece of themselves from being hurt all over again. Silas understood. He didn't call, didn't signal, didn't coax. Each night at the same quiet moment, when the hallway light had gone out, when the wind had stilled, when the last sounds of the day had become nothing more than the creaking breath of wood beneath the floor, he simply placed the old jacket beside Arlo, just as he had the night before. That sound, the faint rustle of fabric brushing against the floor, was the only thing that made Arlo lift his head each night. He never looked for long, never wagged his tail, but there was a deliberate rhythm in that small motion, a slow memory embedded deep in the body, a reflex born of a life that once held trust. Every evening after spreading the jacket, Silas would quietly step away, climb the stairs, and leave the downstairs to the moonlight and the soft breath of grass at the doorstep. The living room became Arlo's private world, one shaped by only three things: darkness, silence, and the scent of a man carried within a jacket. Sometimes close to dawn, Silas would wake to the faintest sound of steps on the wooden floor. Never clear, never steady, just a momentary flutter. But he never went down to check. He let it be, so Arlo would know this space was his to inhabit, with no one waiting on him to change, but always open if he ever wished to try. On the second day, Arlo finished all the dry food. On the third, he nearly emptied the water bowl. No one saw it happen. There were only the quiet remnants left behind in the morning, like whispers etched into the air telling Silas that Arlo was still moving forward one invisible step at a time. That afternoon, a light rain fell. Raindrops tapped gently on the porch roof, leaving soft shadows on the wooden floor. Silas carried a chair outside and sat looking at the trees ahead. He held a warm ceramic cup, face calm, but not heavy. Each time the wind brought in the scent of wet leaves, he glanced toward the half-open door, where Arlo's shadow still lingered quiet inside the house. At one point, Silas shifted his chair slightly closer to the threshold. Not as a gesture of invitation, but more like a quiet message. If you want, I'm here. Arlo watched him from a distance. No one knew what he saw in the man's eyes. Perhaps a trace of someone who once said, "Good boy." Perhaps a breath that once offered shelter in the first storms of spring. Or maybe simply a stillness Arlo hadn't known since the day he was left behind in the woods. He didn't step toward the porch, but that evening when Silas spread the jacket once more, Arlo let out a soft sigh. A breath so light it could have been mistaken for wind through leaves, yet clear enough to be heard by the heart. And that was the first time Silas smiled while bending down, fingers holding the jacket, eyes averted, but voice low and steady. "You don't have to go anywhere. Here is fine." Just 7 words. But perhaps in a world that had once turned its back on Arlo, no one had ever said them like that. That night, when Silas went upstairs, he left his door slightly ajar. The house remained quiet. The rain had stopped, but something warmer hung in the air, like the jacket had finally been touched, not just by a nose, but by something further, the first glimmer of trust kindled by a motionless silhouette beside the wooden porch. The next morning arrived with clear skies and soft sun. Early light slipped through the small window, stringing gold across the floorboards like threads of honey. The wind chime on the porch let out a gentle ring as the first breeze passed through, waking the house without a sound. Silas had been up for a while. He didn't brew coffee like usual. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the porch, back against the doorway, holding a worn gray book with a cracked spine. No clock, no schedule. Just time moving like a shallow stream, slow, even unrushed. Inside, Arlo remained in his usual spot. But something had shifted. He was no longer curled against the wall. Instead, his front legs stretched out, head resting softly on the edge of the jacket. One ear perked up at the sound of pages turning. He didn't come closer, but he didn't pull away either. Silas glanced over his shoulder, and for a brief second their eyes met. Arlo's for the first time seeking him out on purpose. It lasted no longer than a single breath, no deeper than a blink, but it was clear enough to make Silas's heart skip a beat. He didn't turn fully, didn't say anything, just exhaled gently, set the book down beside him, and remained still, as though any sudden movement might dissolve something too delicate to hold. Moments later, Arlo shifted. He stood, walked slowly toward the porcelain bowl beside the rug, and drank. Tiny, careful sips, as if each drop was a question. When he finished, he licked his muzzle lightly, stepped back to the jacket, and lay down again. That was it. No extra gesture. No overt sign of friendliness. No growl. No tail. But Silas knew this was no small thing. Because from the day Arlo entered this house, this was the first time he hadn't disappeared completely into silence. Silas smiled just barely and nodded gently, as if replying to a question no one had spoken aloud. "You're trying," he said, voice quiet, almost like a lullaby to himself. "And that's enough for today." He didn't step inside, didn't move closer, just sat where he was letting the sentence drift into the morning air, then turned a page of the book as if nothing had changed. But inside something had. Like the first flicker of a flame in a house that had forgotten warmth. He thought of Boone, his old dog. How Boone had once conquered his fear of darkness, curling beside his leg during a thunderstorm. But this was different. There were no scratches begging to be let out, no eyes pleading for comfort, no soft whines asking for love. Arlo wasn't asking for anything. He was simply trying. And that effort to Silas was the most precious gift the morning could bring. He stood slowly, walked to the kitchen, and poured a little more clean water into Arlo's bowl. As he crouched down, he placed a folded dry towel beside it, not touching Arlo, just leaving it nearby. Arlo looked at him. Not directly, but enough to say he noticed. There was no sign of fear, no defensiveness, just a gaze weighing its options, like someone who'd once been betrayed and was considering cautiously whether to believe again. The morning continued like a quiet river, smooth and undisturbed. Silas stepped into the backyard, watered the peppermint bushes, adjusted the wire mesh over the corner of the old coop. When he returned, Arlo was still there, lying beside the water bowl, eyes not fully closed. To a stranger, it might have meant nothing. But to Silas, it was a wordless letter, sent straight to the heart. I didn't leave. In the afternoon, sunlight spilled generously across the wooden porch. Silas sat by the table and wrote a few lines into his worn leather notebook hanging for. Arlo looked at me, drank a few sips of water. Just a glance. But in a world where no one dares get close, that glance was a step toward life. When he put the pen down, the wind chime rang softly, like a gentle reply from a house still learning how to breathe with a soul that had just begun to open. That night, the sky changed quickly. As dusk settled, gray clouds began to gather above the distant ridge, filling the sky where light usually lingered. The wind picked up, carrying a chill and the damp, salty scent of earth before rain. Silas's wooden home, always so steady, began to tremble ever so slightly under gusts that swept over the roof. He was reading in the living room when the first flash of lightning split the sky. The pale silver light illuminated the room for a breath, then vanished as if it had never been. A second later, thunder rolled from afar, low and deep like a drum echoing from within the mountains. Arlo lay by the jacket unmoving, but his ears shifted, then folded. His eyes cracked open and turned toward the window where the rain was beginning to etch soft scratches on the frosted glass. Each time the thunder struck, his body flinched just slightly, like a dry leaf startled under a waterfall. Silas said nothing. He walked to the wooden shelf and took down an old gray cushion, meant more for lumbar support than sleep, and placed it gently on the rug near the sofa. Not too close, but close enough that should anyone need shelter, it would be waiting. He returned to his chair, sat down, his gaze on the half-read book, but his mind was elsewhere. The room held stillness, broken only by wind and rain, tapping lightly on the windows, punctuated by thunder like distant drums, calling something long hidden to step forward. And then, within that stillness, Arlo rose. Not quickly, not hesitantly either. He stood, lean frame passing through the amber halo of the table lamp, casting a long shadow against the wall like a spirit stepping out from darkness. The soft sound of his nails on the wooden floor whispered through the room like a presence just barely there. He walked toward Silas, step by step, slow as breath on a fog-heavy morning. Silas didn't move, only tilted his head slightly, remaining where he was still as a quiet landmark. Arlo paused at the rug, glanced at the cushion. Then, for the first time since he arrived, he lay down away from his familiar corner. And gently, so gently it felt like wind could undo it, he rested his head on the cushion, curling into himself as if trying to disappear within the breath of this room. A long sigh slipped from him, thin, weightless, like a butterfly landing after a journey far too long. Silas leaned slightly, his eyes fixed on the shape curled near his feet. His hand rested on his knee, neither reaching out nor withdrawing. But in his gaze something softened, like the surface of a lake finally settling after long weeks of storm. Outside, the wind howled. Rain began falling harder, each drop tapping the porch roof like memory knocking at the door. But inside the house, time stood still. Silas bowed his head, voice barely above a whisper, as though afraid to startle something fragile, just now laid down. "You're tired, huh?" Arlo didn't respond, but his steady breath said he was beginning to believe in the presence beside him. To believe that this place, with its old cushioned wooden floors and a voice that never commanded, was somewhere no one expected anything of him, only that he be. There was something profoundly simple and achingly real in the way a wounded soul chose to rest. Not because it was called, but because the heart whispered that here, it might be safe enough to stay. Silas didn't smile, but the corners of his mouth slackened slightly, like someone who'd just placed the final stone into the foundation of something that hadn't yet begun, but would. That night, Silas didn't go upstairs. He pulled a thin blanket over himself and lay on the sofa, keeping Arlo within sight. He didn't fall asleep right away, as if afraid that when he woke the cushion would be empty, and all of it, this moment, this closeness, would vanish like mist. But as he drifted off to the sound of steady rain, one quiet thought brushed past him, like wind through leaves. A single touch of the head, light as air, was enough to remind him that love doesn't always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with the quiet peace of knowing someone dared to lie beside you in the storm. The next morning, sunlight returned after 3 days of steady rain. The early light caught on pine needles outside the window, scattering golden specks across the wooden floor like dancing fireflies. The damp smell had begun to fade, giving way to the scent of rain-kissed earth and tree sap on the breeze. Silas opened the porch door, holding a cup of hot tea, and stood looking out over the patch of grass in front of the house. The crisp air slipped through his jacket, nudging awake thoughts still tucked in sleep. He inhaled deeply, then turned and met a gaze from inside. Arlo was standing, no longer curled in the corner. He looked at Silas, direct, calm, unafraid. A look that asked, without a sound. "Where are we going today?" Silas placed the tea down on the porch step, said nothing. He stepped back inside, picked up the collar, but didn't fasten it. He slipped his hands into his pockets, turned and began walking down the path that led behind the house toward the soft dunes beyond the woods. His pace was unhurried, but measured, like a man walking ahead, trusting that someone might choose to follow. Behind him, Arlo hesitated for a few seconds. He looked toward the doorway where sunlight stretched across the threshold in a warm golden stripe. Then, with a quiet certainty, one born not from command, but from comfort, he stepped forward. One paw, then another, and then another, as he crossed the doorframe for the very first time since arriving. He didn't run, didn't wag his tail, didn't leap like the joyful dogs you might see in a park. He simply walked, quietly, steadily, but always just a few paces behind Silas. If Silas stopped, Arlo stopped. If Silas turned left, Arlo followed without hesitation. No commands, no glances exchanged. Just silent companionship, a language only those who have been deeply wounded seem to understand. They passed through a narrow path, winding beneath tall trees, where fallen leaves had woven a soft carpet beneath their feet. Birds sang somewhere in the distance, leaves brushed against shoulders as they fell, together forming a wordless painting of early morning peace. At the end of the path, the sand came into view, a stretch of soft, pale earth unfolding along the edge of the lake. The water shimmered under sunlight, mirroring the drifting white clouds, like a watercolor sky still drying. Silas stepped forward, his boots leaving deep prints in the damp shoreline. Arlo stopped where the grass met the sand. He looked down, then looked at Silas. A breeze nudged at his back, gentle as a hand. And for the first time, Arlo placed a paw onto the sand. 1 foot, then 2. All 4 eventually pressing into the surface like quiet declarations, "I am here. I'm no longer stuck in the shadows of yesterday." Silas turned, and for the first time he saw 2 sets of prints, one large, one small, side by side on the pale shore, not close enough to touch, not far enough to lose sight of each other. The prints continued in a steady line, curving toward the end of the lake where the sunlight poured down like golden syrup. They kept walking. Arlo didn't surge ahead, didn't fall behind. He simply matched Silas's pace, like someone who had grown used to being guided, but not pushed. Silas said nothing, but his lips softened, then relaxed. His eyes fell on the trail behind him, and something inside his chest released. A quiet truth forming like a breath, "I'm not walking alone anymore." They reached the far bend of the shoreline and circled toward the water. Silas sat on a large rock, splashing his face with the lake's cool surface. Arlo stood a few feet away, watching, then approached. Not cautiously, but calmly. He lowered his head, took a few sips, and lifted it again. Water slipped from his muzzle like dew from a young leaf, clear, clean, at peace. Silas looked at him and spoke, his voice breaking the silence not as a disruption, but as a recognition. "The sand keeps our steps today. Tomorrow the waves will wash them away. But I'll remember everyone you walked beside me this morning." Arlo didn't react, but his gaze softened. And when the wind stirred again, Silas lowered his hand, not to touch, but to place it gently near Arlo's back, a quiet gesture that said, "If you want this hand, we'll always be here." On the walk home, new footprints continued to appear in the sand. The ground had dried since morning, so every step left a sharper impression. At one point, Silas stopped to tie his laces, and when he looked up, Arlo was standing right beside him, not rushing, not hovering, just there as if to say, "I'll wait when you pause." By the time they returned, the sun was high, bathing the porch in radiant light. Arlo stepped onto the first wooden step, and lay down beside the door. He didn't return to the corner where the jacket had been. He chose a new spot, closer, brighter, and open enough to see the woods ahead. Silas opened the door and stepped inside, but this time he left it ajar, as if to answer the quiet question Arlo had been asking with each small gesture. "Can I trust you?" And Silas's open door said, "Yes." One step at a time, one paw print each morning. From the day those footprints pressed into the shoreline, things began to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but like mist settling over the front steps at dawn. You never notice the moment it begins. You just look up one day and realize everything's different. Arlo no longer woke in the dark. He started rising before Silas had even finished brewing his first cup of tea. Each morning he made his way to the large window in the living room, the one that framed the light cutting through the trees, casting a golden beam across the wooden floor. He stood there still as a sculpture, ears alert, nose twitching as it took in the scent of morning air. The wind chime outside whispered its tune. Arlo listened. Birds sang beyond the pines. He tilted his head. The breeze stirred his thick coat. He didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't make a sound. But Silas knew Arlo was fully present in that moment. Silas watched from afar, never interrupting. He let Arlo have that space, his own quiet world by the window between sun and wind, where a dog who once hid in darkness now stood tall, breathing deeply, looking outward. Then one morning Silas approached. Not too quickly, not unsure. He knelt beside him and with gentle purpose rested his hand atop Arlo's head. Time paused. His hand touched warm, soft fur. His fingers didn't tighten. They simply rested there like a promise, "I'm here." Arlo didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He didn't retreat into his corner. And in that still second, like a flower opening to the first warmth of spring, his thin tail moved. Not much, not wildly, just a small, delicate wag, like the quiet reply of someone who had once lost faith and was now offering a tiny shard of heart back into the world. Silas didn't speak. But inside him, something melted, like the last frost of winter cracking under a sudden sunbeam. It felt familiar. Like the way Boone used to rest his head on Silas's leg that first winter they lived together. Like the way Silas once believed he'd never bond again after Boone was gone. But today, with that quiet wag beneath his hand, Silas understood that some souls don't need to speak to be heard, don't need to be called to come close. He kept his hand there for a moment longer, then withdrew. Not petting, not praising, not reaching for more than was offered. He left behind just enough space as if to say, if you take another step, there'll always be room to receive it. That day, the window in the living room stayed open wider than usual. Silas placed a floor cushion nearby, low enough to sit flush with the ground. He sat there beside Arlo every morning, doing nothing extraordinary. Just breathing sometimes, glancing toward the woods. Sometimes Arlo would get up, circle twice, then settle again, resting his head on Silas's leg. Not fully, just enough to make a small anchor between them. And that was enough. For now. For both of them. From that little seat, they watched the light slowly fill the room, listened to birds calling each other from afar, and measured time by the silence that passed between them. One morning, while Silas stepped out to refill his water, he returned to find Arlo sitting quietly at the front door, waiting. Not staring outside, not looking around, just sitting, exactly in the spot where Silas usually stood. And when Silas approached, Arlo turned his head slightly, then stepped gently aside as if to say, "You first." Silas paused, not out of surprise, but from something deeper. Because in a world where everything is taught, trained, repeated until it becomes reflex, Arlo had just done something entirely on his own. And perhaps there is no greater reward for someone who once lost faith than to witness another soul slowly reclaiming themselves. That evening, Silas wrote one quiet line into his leather notebook. The window doesn't just let light in. It lets trust in, too. One small tail wag, but enough to call it a new beginning. Summer passed gently, marked by soft mornings and afternoons, filled with the faint scent of sun-dried grass carried by the breeze. The wildflowers at the forest's edge had grown taller, wrapping the tree line in delicate color. The shade beneath the porch stretched wide enough for Silas to read comfortably at midday, and quiet enough for Arlo to lie by the step, eyes half-closed, ears alert to every subtle sound the world offered. The house next door had been recently renovated, with a bright red tiled roof, a small orchard of orange trees, and a neatly painted white wooden fence. A new family had moved in. Quiet people. Silas had met the mother Nora once at the post office. They exchanged only a faint smile. Her son's name was Elliot, 8 years old. Small-framed, thin like a young sapling, with pale skin and tousled brown hair tucked beneath a worn fabric cap he always wore. Elliot didn't run, didn't shout, didn't laugh loud like most kids his age. He preferred sitting beneath the orange tree, tracing circles into the dirt with a stick or staring at the sky for long, thoughtful stretches. Elliot was born mute, a world without sound from his very first breath. Silas had heard it from a neighbor's brief explanation, but he wasn't curious. Everyone has their own way of living in silence, he thought. Like Arlo. Like himself. A man who had lost more calls in life than he could remember answering. The first time Arlo met Elliot, the sun was soft. Silas was repairing a section of the back fence when he heard small footsteps. Looking up, he saw Elliot standing just beyond the fence. Small hands clutching the white wood, his eyes full of quiet curiosity. Arlo was lying beneath the pine head, resting on his front paws. When Elliot's gaze settled on him, Arlo didn't move. But something in his eyes softened, as if recognizing another soul who also knew what it meant to live in a world where words were never the answer. Two pairs of eyes, one from an 8-year-old boy, the other from a dog who'd once been abandoned, met through a gap in the fence. No hello, no barking, just a gaze that lingered open and unafraid. Silas stopped what he was doing. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak. Elliot slowly opened his palm, not waving, not reaching, just holding it there. A gesture of invitation, or perhaps a silent assurance, I mean no harm. Arlo walked forward with deliberate caution. He stopped just at the fence, lowered his head, and brushed the empty space between them with his nose. Elliot threaded a small finger through the gap, not quite close enough to touch, but close enough that Arlo's breath stirred the fine hairs on his hand. No words were exchanged. But the moment felt so clear, so real, that Silas could almost hear a quiet dialogue echoing in his mind. I don't speak. I'm not great at listening to commands anymore. I just want someone to understand. So do I. Elliot sat down in the grass beside the fence, playing with a small stone in his palm. Arlo laid down on his side of the fence, resting his head against the wooden base. And they stayed like that, boy and dog, in a silence that stretched for nearly half an hour. Silas went inside, brewed 2 cups of water, one for himself and one to place gently beside Elliot at the fence. The boy nodded once in quiet thanks. Arlo didn't move, but he tilted his head, eyes still fixed on the child, sitting just beyond the white posts. The next day, Elliot returned. He brought with him a worn fabric ball, placed it on the grass, and gently nudged it under the fence. Arlo looked at the ball, then back at Elliot. He didn't pounce, didn't chew. He simply pushed it back with his nose, lightly, just enough for it to roll back across the line. Elliot smiled, and that was the first time Silas saw it. That quiet, rare smile. It wasn't bright. It didn't beam. But there was something in it, something soft and luminous that made a person want to sit still a while longer, breathe a little softer, just so they wouldn't break something so fragile. That night, Silas wrote a fence meant to divide. Turned out to be the place where two silences found each other. One boy who doesn't speak, one dog who doesn't bark. And in the way they looked at each other, I swear they were speaking a language the world has never bothered to understand. From that day on, Elliot and Arlo formed a quiet kind of agreement. No one spoke it, no one wrote it down, but each afternoon, exactly at 4 o'clock, Elliot would appear with tiny bits of bread cupped in his hand. And Arlo, who had somehow memorized the rhythm, would be there on his side of the fence waiting for the boy, like one waits for a familiar breeze. It all began so naturally. One evening, Elliot arrived earlier than usual, clutching a paper bag filled with crumbled biscuits. He glanced around, nervous as if afraid someone might tell him he shouldn't, then quietly approached the fence. His eyes still held their silence, but when Arlo came near, he offered his hand. Not waving, not calling, just sharing. Arlo lowered his head, sniffed the mixture of biscuit and sun-warmed paper, and then with a slow deliberation, took a piece. Not with hunger, not in haste, but gently, as though each crumb held an entire story. Silas stood further back, leaning against a pine, a cup of tea cooling in his hand. He didn't step closer. He simply watched, sometimes from the kitchen window, sometimes from the shadowed edge of the porch. And every afternoon, it became a ritual. Elliot would come sit by the fence, crumbs in his hand. Arlo sat opposite him, not pushing forward, not impatient. He simply sat with the full presence of a creature who had once been forgotten, offering himself in quiet companionship to someone who needed it. One day, Elliot pulled a blank sheet of paper and a few pieces of crayon from his pocket. He began to draw, his lines uncertain but filled with patience. From the window, Silas watched closely, and then he realized the boy was sketching a dog with upright ears sitting by a fence. Elliot didn't add many details, just a few strokes. But the dog's eyes in the drawing held something unmistakably Arlo, silent, watchful, and ready to stay, if trusted. The next afternoon, Arlo was already waiting by the fence before Elliot arrived. He looked toward the neighboring house, then stood and walked to his usual spot. Elliot appeared a few minutes later, still carrying his usual bag of crumbs, and when he saw Arlo already there, he smiled. This time he sat closer to the fence, close enough that if he stretched out his hand, he could brush against Arlo's ears. Silas stepped quietly onto the porch, standing behind the shade curtain. He watched the scene unfold, a boy who couldn't call out, and a dog who never learned to obey commands. Yet the understanding between them ran deeper than anything words could describe. He thought to himself, some friendships don't begin with a hello, and they don't need to end with a goodbye. Some friendships, like Elliot and Arlo's, begin with empathy, the kind shared only between souls who know what it's like to feel misplaced. That evening, Silas wrote in his journal, "They understand each other through silence. No calling, no waving. One child who cannot speak, one dog who no longer listens. But every afternoon they sit across from each other, sharing pieces of bread and glances. And I understand some friendships don't need teaching. They just need presence. At the right moment, in the right place." The next day, when Silas was preparing for his usual walk, Arlo didn't follow him like before. Instead, he remained by the fence, his eyes following Elliot, who was sitting under the orange tree, sketching in the dirt. Silas didn't urge him. He simply rested a hand on Arlo's shoulder and gave a small nod, as if to say, "I'll go alone. You stay." And Arlo stayed, stretched beneath the sunlight, head resting gently on his front paws, ears twitching slightly as Elliot hummed a melody without words, lips forming shapes that carried no sound. The breeze swept through, carrying with it the scent of baked bread from the neighboring house. And though Silas was already far from the porch, something inside him softened. Maybe he thought the greatest things in life begin with the smallest things, a glance, a shared crumb, a fence that doesn't really divide. That day the wind came early from the sea tinged with salt and the dry scent of scorched grass along the hillside. The sky stretched deep and blue above the lake below, mirrored it perfectly. Sunlight spilled across the sand. Not harsh, but warm enough to make you want to step barefoot into the world without regret. Silas carried his old camera, its edges wrapped in worn leather. He hadn't taken many pictures since Boone passed. Every frame afterward felt hollow. But that morning, when Arlo looked up with an expression that felt like an invitation, and Elliot stood by the fence with his faded watercolor set, Silas knew it was time to bring the camera out again. They went together to the shore, Silas, Arlo, and Elliot. The boy carried a paper bag with drawing paper brushes and a few half-used pots of color. Arlo walked between them, his stride steadier than ever. His ears were perked, catching the salty breeze. His tail no longer tucked close to his belly. It swung gently with his steps like a quiet rhythm only those who truly listened could hear. At the beach, Silas settled on a large rock and opened the camera. Elliot unrolled his paper, choosing a patch of sand free of stones. Arlo stood still for a moment, lifting his head as if to ask, "Now," and then Arlo ran. Not wild, not reckless. Just light-footed, like he was relearning how to breathe, how to live, how to let joy fill the spaces once taken by fear. Sand sprayed with each bound. Wind lifted his coat like a tiny flag waving at the horizon. Every time a wave crashed near him, he turned back to glance at Elliot, like saying, "Watch me." Silas raised the camera. He didn't click right away. He looked through the lens, heart slowing because the moment was too full. Not with perfect composition, not with light, but with the undeniable beauty of a life once collapsed, now running freely through the wind. He pressed the shutter. Click. That soft sound broke the air just as Arlo turned his head tail, mid-wag, mouth slightly open, as if smiling. And that was the moment Silas realized. He was smiling too. For the first time in years, a real smile. Unforced, without sorrow, needing no explanation. Just a smile because someone he cared about was living the most beautiful version of themselves. He looked at the image on the camera screen. It captured not only Arlo's sprint, but a line of sunlight across the sand, a wave pulling back, and Elliot's small shadow in the distance, brush poised, tapping gently on paper. Elliot painted slowly. He didn't stare at the paper much. He watched Arlo. His hands dipped the brush into the water, swept it across a pale blue, dragging a shoreline into place. Then a deep brown for Arlo's back, white for the foam, soft orange for the glow of evening, and finally, a gentle black stroke for Arlo's running eyes. No words were spoken, but every brush stroke Elliot made said what language never quite could, understanding affection and the quiet offering of self. He wasn't trying to make it realistic. He was painting what his heart remembered. Silas walked over and sat beside him. He looked at the picture, not yet finished, but already full. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice low, but warm enough for Elliot to look up. The boy smiled again, still silent. But this time he dipped his brush once more. A new color, muted blue-gray, soft and subtle. Elliot painted a line from Arlo's figure toward the corner of the paper, where Silas's outline had begun to appear faint but present. It seemed that in the picture all of them were linked, not by color or form, but by something unseen, and yet undeniably clear. Arlo, after his run, returned to lie beside Elliot's feet, his breaths light, tongue out, eyes shimmering. He didn't roll in the sand, didn't bark with joy. but in that quiet gaze Silas could see it happiness, complete and wordless. That night, once home, Silas developed the photograph he had taken. He placed it in a small wooden frame and hung it on the wall opposite the front door, where anyone who entered would see it. Beneath the image, he wrote in a soft, slanted ink, "An afternoon wind, a trail of paw prints, and a soul who once chose silence, now smiling with the sun." That same evening, a breeze passed through the neighboring orange grove, sending a few leaves spinning like letters from another season. There was no rain, only the kind of softness that made you want to sit on the porch and let the minutes stretch. Nora, Elliot's mother, had just finished hanging a wind curtain when she turned and noticed her son already seated on the porch, quiet and calm. In his lap was a large picture book, one he had read countless times. The cover bore an illustration of a small boy and a fox sitting together. Gentle lines, simple signs. Elliot didn't read aloud, but his hands moved in a fluent rhythm, each motion a part of a story only he fully understood. Sunlight filtered through the orange leaves, painting long golden strips across the wooden steps. Elliot leaned against a porch column, legs stretched out, eyes fixed on the pages, hands still moving. He didn't know that on the other side of the fence, Arlo was watching. Arlo moved softly toward the familiar wooden gate, his head slightly bowed. The latch had been left unhooked since Elliot started coming over more often. Silas had left it ajar, just wide enough for a child to pass through and just wide enough for Arlo to understand that if he wished, the gate would always be open. He nudged it gently with his nose. It creaked open, noiseless. Elliot turned at the sound of paws brushing the grass. His eyes widened just a bit. Then slowly, he set the book down beside him and patted the empty space on the porch floor next to his feet. Arlo walked over, not hesitantly, not retreating like in the early days, and settled down in the spot Elliot had invited him to. He didn't move, just rested his body close and gently laid his head across the boy's lap. No one spoke. No words were needed. Elliot raised a hand slowly, cautiously like one afraid to startle, and placed his tiny palm on Arlo's brow. Arlo closed his eyes. A sigh escaped. Soft light like someone finally setting down a burden they'd carried too long. And at that moment, Nora stood quietly at the door, eyes brimming. She didn't cry from simple sentiment. She cried because since the day Elliot was born, he had never let anyone come this close. Not animals, not classmates, not therapists. His hands, always withdrawn into their own world, had never become a resting place for another soul. Yet today, a dog, without training or instruction, had chosen Elliot to lean on. And Elliot, the same boy who used to flinch at sound checks, who avoided eye contact, who often sat in the farthest seat of the special class, had now raised his hand and placed it on another living being with all the trust his heart could offer. Nora turned away, stepping quietly back inside, not to interrupt. But one hand clutched her chest, where her heart now beat not from anxiety, but from something warm, something real. On the porch, Elliot leaned slightly, pulled his book back to his lap, and continued reading with his hands. Arlo remained still, his ears twitching whenever a page turned. Occasionally he blinked and let out a deep breath, not from fatigue, but as if to say, "This place feels right." As the sun stretched long over the garden, their shadows spilled across the porch floor like two brushstrokes from the same palette, not identical, but unmistakably of the same tone. Elliot began to nod, not quite asleep, but fully at peace. And Arlo, still resting on the boy's lap, closed his eyes again, letting time drift by like ripples across a quiet lake. Silas stepped outside, stopping a few paces away, careful not to disturb what had formed. He stood still watching, and understood there was no need for words, no need for a photograph to hold this moment. Some memories didn't need frames. They had already carved themselves into the soul. That night, when the breeze turned cooler, Arlo finally left the porch and returned to his favorite rug. Elliot stroked his ear gently, then stood book in hand and went inside. Nora looked at her son, then at Silas, and whispered, perhaps for the first time, with a quiet voice, "Thank you for not trying to fix them." Both Elliot and Arlo, they don't need someone to teach them how to heal. They just need someone to believe in their way, Silas nodded. And inside him, a thought rang with clarity. A peaceful sleep doesn't come from being beside someone who teaches, but beside someone who is calm enough to let you be exactly who you are. One summer afternoon, when sunlight tilted through the kitchen window like threads of golden silk, Silas sat quietly at the table, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Through the open door he could see Elliot, reading on the grass outside the porch, and beside him, as always, lay Arlo, head slightly lifted, ears perked, eyes following every subtle movement the boy made. It wasn't the gaze of a dog waiting for command, nor was it the eager look of one expecting treats or play. That gaze held something deeper, as if Arlo were watching over, protecting not by instinct, but from a memory that had once been awakened. Silas set his cup down and stepped out quietly, careful not to draw Arlo's attention. And then he saw it clearly. Every time Elliot shifted, stood, or leaned, Arlo adjusted too, not chasing, not rushing, just rising, circling briefly, then settling again, as if to confirm everything was still safe. Once when Elliot dropped his book, Arlo gently nudged it back with his nose. Elliot smiled and brushed a hand over the dog's ear, and in that moment, Arlo closed his eyes. A chill ran through Silas, not from the breeze, but from a thought that rose unmistakably clear. This isn't the first time Arlo has stayed beside a child, and maybe something happened the last time. That evening, after Elliot had returned home, Arlo remained lying at the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on the narrow path where the boy had walked away. Even though Elliot was no longer in sight, Arlo kept watching, as if waiting for something to return. Silas sat down beside him, saying nothing. He simply reached out and rested his hand on Arlo's back. A faint tremor rippled beneath the dog's fur. "You used to live with the child, didn't you?" he whispered, knowing there would be no answer in words. Moonlight slanted across the lawn. In that blurred silver glow, Silas noticed something he hadn't seen before whenever Elliot was near Arlo. Never fully closed his eyes. He always kept one lid slightly open, his ears on gentle alert, as though he'd once lost something too suddenly and now couldn't afford to let his guard down again. That night, Silas dug through the old paperwork the shelter had sent him. The pages were thin, the ink faded, and the notes brief, male black and dark brown coat. Found near the edge of the forest by the old campground. Deep rope cuts around neck, no response to humans, no response to food. Does not attack, but avoids contact. There was nothing about what had happened before he was found. But in the days that followed, every small action from Arlo began piecing together fragments of a silent past. When Elliot tripped, Arlo would position himself in front of him, eyes scanning every direction. When Elliot fell asleep on the porch, Arlo curled close against his back, warm like a blanket. When a stranger passed the gate, Arlo would step forward. No growl, no bared teeth. Just a quiet stance planted firmly between Elliot and the unknown. Silas started documenting Arlo's behaviors like a careful observer. And the more he watched Arlo respond to Elliot, the more convinced he became. This dog had once been someone's protector. Maybe a boy who lived near the forest. Maybe a girl who used to rest her hand on Arlo's head before falling asleep. Maybe a child to whom Arlo had made a silent promise to stay to guard. But a promise that was torn away the moment that rough rope bit into his neck. And now with Elliot before him, it wasn't about replacing the past. It was about continuing a bond that had once been cut short. One night when the world was fast asleep, Silas stepped onto the porch with his journal and a pencil. The moon hung high, bright enough to scribble a few quiet thoughts. Some eyes don't look to wait. They look to protect. Arlo isn't playing with Elliot. He's guarding Elliot like a memory that never left. The eyes of a creature once abandoned. Now holding close the one thing he's afraid to lose again. Silas looked up. Arlo lay curled just outside the doorway, his body shaped perfectly to the outline of the porch curtain. Elliot was safe inside, but Arlo remained out there like a silent sentinel. And for the first time, Silas no longer thought of him as the dog. He thought of him by a different name, a warmer word, a closer one, friend. The storm arrived earlier than forecasted. Past midnight, winds began to slice through the shingles and slip under the doors, howling like blades of ice tearing at the quiet. The sky had darkened since the afternoon, but no one expected the clouds to weigh down this heavily. When the first sheets of rain lashed the roof, everything outside seemed to flinch. Silas was in his study, the dim lamp casting a glow onto the framed photo of Arlo and Elliot. He opened his notebook to jot down a few lines, when the lights blinked, then vanished. A second of disorientation. Then darkness. The entire neighborhood lost power. The wind howled louder. Thunder cracked across the hills, shaking the window panes. Arlo, curled near the porch, bolted upright. Ears, stiff eyes sharp, no barking, no pacing. Just a body coiled in complete focus like a string pulled taut. Silas switched on a flashlight and checked the breaker box. Nothing. He reached for his phone. Weak signal. A notification appeared: power outage. Widespread due to thunderstorm and high winds. He turned back toward the porch, intending to call Arlo in, only to find the dog had vanished. Next door, Elliot was fast asleep. His small room sat close to the basement, where Nora had once mentioned a strange damp odor during heavy rains. The plumbers had promised to inspect the old water lines, but schedules shifted, appointments delayed, and the issue faded into the background. Wind now pushed against the slightly cracked basement door. A thin stream of water began seeping onto the wooden floor, spreading like a quiet oil stain. The air grew thick, musty, acrid, and tinged with something chemical, like old gasoline mingling with rainwater and rusted pipes. Elliot lay on his side, breathing softly, unaware that below him, a corroded pipeline had ruptured. And now gas was leaking upward, silent, colorless, mingling with the cold night air. Arlo raced through the backyard. The white gate was still ajar. He didn't bark. He ran. Through the rain, beneath the slashing lightning, toward the house where Elliot slept. He stopped beneath the neighbor's awning and listened. A faint breath echoed from inside. But buried within it, Arlo caught a scent. Sharp, unnatural. A smell his instinct warned him against. Not smoke, not ordinary mildew. Something else. Something he remembered from the time he'd been abandoned. When smoke had risen through the cracks of the wooden shed he was locked in. He pawed the door. Once. No answer. Again. Harder. Silence inside. Then, with his entire weight, he pushed. The door creaked inward. It had been left unlocked. And in an instant, Arlo vanished into the darkness. Silas, meanwhile, was searching. His flashlight scanned the backyard, then swept toward the neighboring house. Nora's door was ajar. He called out Arlo. No reply. Then, a bark. The first bark all night, sharp and urgent, cut through the storm, echoing from Elliot's room. Inside, Elliot woke to the sound of Arlo's bark. Not a growl, but a desperate signal. He coughed. The air burned. His eyes stung, his head throbbed. Arlo jumped onto the bed, nudging Elliot's shoulder with his nose. The boy jolted awake, blinking in confusion. But then, he saw Arlo. And just behind him, the beam of a flashlight, Silas rushing in, shouting, "Elliot, come with me!" The boy wavered, dizzy, slow. But Arlo turned, growled softly. Not in warning, but as a guide. He sprinted ahead, paused, looked back, then moved again. Elliot rose to his feet, legs unsteady. But he followed. Because even in the thick of darkness, Arlo's eyes glowed, steady, unwavering, like twin beacons in the storm. Silas caught Elliot in his arms and swiftly carried him outside just as the smell of gas grew stronger. He coughed violently, scooped Arlo up as well, and rushed them both out to the porch. Minutes later, Nora came running back from a friend's house, where she had stayed during the blackout. The moment she reached the yard, she screamed, seeing her son lying in Silas's arms and Arlo curled beside him, still on guard. That night, after the firefighters confirmed a gas leak in the basement, the entire block was evacuated. Elliot was examined. He was safe. And when a nurse asked, "How did you know to get out just in time?" Nora gripped her son's hand tightly, but Elliot didn't answer. He simply turned to Arlo, placed his small hand on the dog's head, and gave a quiet nod. Silas later wrote in his notebook, he didn't need an alarm, didn't need a voice, just needed a heart that still believed in one thing if he'd once lost someone. Then this time he would guard with everything he had. The wind still hissed across the porch, but it had softened. The final winter storm had grown tired and eased. The trees drooped with water, the streets glistened with puddles, and the entire neighborhood of Northlake lay under a veil of darkness. Power hadn't returned, and phones blinked with their last few battery bars. Inside Silas's small kitchen, a candle flickered on the wooden table, casting soft ribbons of light across the ceiling. Arlo lay stretched on the rug. His body relaxed, but his ears upright. He hadn't moved for over an hour since returning from Elliot's house. The gas leak incident seemed to have passed, yet something in Arlo's instincts stayed taut, like a wire wound too tight. Silas was reheating tea on a makeshift gas stove. He glanced at Arlo, saw the dog watching the door intently. That posture was too familiar. Arlo hadn't closed his eyes once since they got back. The wind shifted abruptly, then Arlo sprang to his feet. His nose sniffed sharply. A strange scent slipped through the doorframe, acrid, bitter, faintly charred, like slow-burning fabric. Silas didn't even have time to speak before Arlo let out a low, warning whine. It wasn't panic. It was a signal, clear and unmistakable. Something was wrong. Then a beat later, Arlo growled, quiet but firm, just long enough to pierce the thick silence of the post-storm night. The sound cracked through the stillness like a whip snapping across the air. Arlo lunged for the door. This time he didn't wait for anyone. He slammed his shoulder into it. The door flew open, hitting the wall with a sharp thud. Arlo Silas called out, grabbing his coat and bolting after him. Outside, the air had thickened. Silas's eyes followed the direction Arlo had gone. And there, trailing from the rooftop of Elliot's home, was a thin wisp of smoke. It didn't pour. It curled faint and spectral, winding around the balcony like a ghost. Arlo shot through the fence like an arrow. Then he barked, for the first time since he left the shelter. This bark wasn't just a sound. It was a siren. Silas's boots slapped against the wet earth. He looked up. His heart pounded as he caught a flicker of red glowing through the basement window of Elliot's house. Small, but enough to mean one thing: the fire had started. "Is anyone home?" Silas screamed, pounding on the front door as he ran. No answer. Through the murky haze of smoke, he saw Elliot's bedroom window still shut. Nora was out, maybe still not back. Elliot was asleep, and without someone to wake him, the boy wouldn't smell the smoke, wouldn't hear the flames, Arlo had already vanished inside. Silas kicked the door, hard, once, then again. The hinge cracked and the door swung open. Smoke poured out, thick and hot. Silas crouched low, crawling past the living room. Elliot's bedroom door stood slightly ajar. He burst in, calling Elliot, "It's Uncle Silas." In the corner of the room, Elliot was crouched down, arms over his head, eyes wide in panic. The faint glow from the window lit up his face. Dusty with soot, but unmistakably him. And right beside him, Arlo stood wedged between the boy and the smoke. His fur had darkened with soot and dampened by water, but his eyes shone unwavering. "Good boy, Arlo," Silas gasped, rushing forward. He wrapped Elliot in his coat, lifting him into his arms. He shouted over his shoulder, "Somebody call for help! Fire, get the firefighters here!" Neighbors began pouring into the yard, some with flashlights, others carrying ladders or dialing emergency services from their motorbikes. But no one got there in time before Arlo had already led Elliot and Silas out through the choking smoke. In the front yard, Nora arrived just as they emerged. She dropped to her knees when she saw her son carried out safe. She clutched Elliot tightly, her eyes locked on Arlo. This silent creature panting hard paws streaked with ash, but gazed steady as ever. That night the whole neighborhood whispered and repeated, "If it hadn't been for that dog," no one would have noticed in time. The kids didn't see the smoke. Another minute and... It's strange. Some dogs, they just know things before we do. Silas sat on the porch steps, gently stroking Arlo's back. His voice was low but filled with gratitude. He doesn't need to be taught. He just needs to be trusted. And once he is, he'll guard another life with the memory of one he almost lost. The smoke spread fast. In those old wooden houses, fire caught onto anything, from curtain fabric to aging wall paint, and once the scent of melted plastic mixed with mildew rose up, the air seemed to collapse in on itself. Thick, suffocating, pressing down like a heavy blanket on a sleeper's head. Elliot, still in deep slumber after the stormy night, noticed nothing at first. He had grown used to the darkness, to the stillness, and didn't yet know the warning scent of smoke. In that small second-floor room where light barely seeped past the half-drawn curtain, the boy lay curled on his side, dreaming dreams only he understood. Downstairs, Arlo took a deep breath. The smoke stung his eyes shut for a brief second. But then he opened them again. His ears perked. He scratched at the wooden door, firm strikes echoing like knocks that demanded an answer. When none came, Arlo spun and bolted up the stairs, each step as if already memorized. The second-floor hallway was already hazy. Arlo pushed his nose against each door until one budged. Elliot's room. He slipped inside and saw Elliot face pale breath, shallow. Arlo didn't hesitate. He padded to the edge of the bed and licked the boy's cheek, firm and urgent. Elliot's eyes fluttered open, dazed but enough to see the familiar shape before him. And in that instant, all fear began to recede, because he saw Arlo's eyes, steady, like solid ground in the middle of a quake. Elliot hadn't even sat up when Arlo gently tugged at the hem of his pajama shirt, just enough to pull it forward, then released it and stepped back, glancing toward the door, then back at Elliot with unwavering clarity in his eyes. "Follow me." Elliot propped himself up, coughing faintly. His legs trembled as he stood, but Arlo returned to his side and gently nudged the boy's knee, as if to lend him strength. And so two souls, one who never spoke and one who had once been left behind, walked side by side through the smoke. Downstairs the smoke had thickened. Arlo led Elliot through the living room. When they reached the front door, he rose on his hind legs and scratched hard, 3 times. Then for the first time he barked, loud and sharp like a siren piercing the silent night. Woof, woof, woof. The barks echoed through the smoke-choked walls all the way to Silas's yard. He had been calling to the neighbors, his voice rough from the smoke, but that bark made him spin around. "Arlo, I hear you," he shouted. Arlo barked again. Elliot had collapsed beside the door, coughing violently, one hand clutching his chest, but his eyes stayed on Arlo, drained but calm. Within minutes, neighbors gathered. One brought a small fire extinguisher. Another was already calling emergency services. Silas lunged forward and kicked the door open. It slammed wide, and right there stood Arlo, blocking the smoke with his body, shielding Elliot. Silas scooped Elliot into his arms, yelling, "He's here!" Arlo led me to him. One neighbor helped guide Silas and Elliot outside. Another shined a flashlight back toward the doorway, and through the thick, pale smoke, the image of Arlo standing tall. His coat darkened with sweat and ash, his eyes locked in watchfulness. Became something no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. Later, as firefighters extinguished the small fire caused by faulty wiring in the damp basement, Arlo was brought out onto the lawn. He collapsed into the grass, exhausted, panting heavily. Elliot was placed on a small stretcher and given oxygen. But when he opened his eyes, the first thing he did was reach out toward Arlo. He didn't say a word. He just found Arlo's ear and touched it softly. And Arlo, tired beyond measure, lifted his head and pressed it gently into the boy's open palm. Then he closed his eyes, not from weakness, but because at last he felt safe enough to sleep. That night inside a makeshift medical tent, Silas opened his notebook and wrote. That was the first time Arlo truly barked. Not for food, not because someone got too close, but because he made a choice to protect and knew exactly when to raise his voice. One bark, but it rang out like a heartbeat. Because this life, once silent, now knows exactly when to cry out for someone he loves. Morning arrived late. After a night thick with ash and sirens, the sun filtered gently over the rooftops like a blanket laid over shoulders still trembling from the chaos. In the town hospital, golden light spilled through the window, falling onto the white hospital bed where Elliot lay, a thin blanket pulled over his legs, the IV line dripping steadily beside him. He hadn't spoken since they brought him in, but his hands moved, and every movement, each twitch, each stretch, reached only in one direction toward Arlo. The German shepherd lay curled beneath the bed, a thin blanket draped over him by a nurse. A patch of fur on his left flank had singed the skin beneath reddened. With every breath, Arlo trembled, his rasping exhales hinting at the damage smoke had left in his lungs. A vet had checked him during the night, minor burns, a mild respiratory injury. Not life-threatening if monitored closely. But what concerned the staff most wasn't the physical injuries. It was how Arlo refused to leave Elliot's side. Silas had tried lifting him up gently, coaxing him out. But Arlo pushed away, circled the hall, and returned to the right door. Lying again beneath Elliot's bed, quiet, watchful, resolute. "I have something left to do here," his presence seemed to say. Elliot opened his eyes at exactly 8 a.m. Nora gripped his hand, tears brimming. But Elliot didn't look at her right away. His gaze drifted downward, to where Arlo lay, with his head resting against the bed frame, his eyes half closed but still locked onto the boy's face. Elliot stretched out a trembling hand. Nora held her breath as she saw him begin to move his fingers. Sign language. One letter. Then another. Slow, but clear. My friend spoke for me. Silas froze. The entire room fell silent. Not because the boy had spoken, but because his tiny hands told a truth that needed no voice. Arlo, his silent friend, voiceless for months, had chosen the exact moment to bark for the first time. Not to save himself, to save Elliot. to say the words Elliot's body hadn't yet found the strength to say. A nurse whispered voice choked with wonder. "That's not just a dog. That's someone who knows when to stay and when to speak." The whole morning, nurses rotated in and out of the room to tend to Arlo. They cooled his burns with soft pads, bandaged his side, and placed a cushion beneath his head to help him breathe more easily. Arlo never pulled away, never growled, never flinched. The only time he stirred was when Elliot coughed, and each time Arlo would turn his head to make sure the sound still came from a living breath. Silas stepped into the hallway, wiping his hands dry, a glass of water in the other. He opened his notebook and added another line. "Some wounds never leave scars, because they're healed by a glance, a soft touch, and the silence that stretches gently across seasons of pain." Arlo didn't need someone to heal him. He just needed a reason to believe that silence isn't always the same as being abandoned. And he found that reason in the small fingers that for the first time used touch to speak. That afternoon, as Elliot napped, a nurse suggested taking Arlo to the next room for a more detailed checkup. Nora knelt down and gently stroked his ear, whispering, "You did something that most grown-ups spend a lifetime struggling to do. You held a child through the fire, and then you gave him a voice." Arlo let out a soft whine, not out of pain perhaps, but as if he understood. That evening, as Silas sat beside the window, gazing at the glow from the corridor lights, a quiet truth settled in his chest. Arlo, the creature once labeled unresponsive, unadoptable at the shelter, was now lying in a hospital room, woven into a dream no one had dared to write before. The burns would heal. The coughing would pass. But Arlo's eyes, those once hollow, always watching blank walls, were now watching a boy. Not with fear, but with the quiet urge to protect. And Elliot, the child who had never spoken, had chosen Arlo as the first voice he let speak to the world. The small fire that day eventually faded, leaving behind a few blackened streaks on Elliot's walls, a lingering haze on the second-floor windows, and a patch of scorched fur along Arlo's flank. But the deepest thing it left behind was something no one could see, because it settled into a very soft corner of memory. Elliot was discharged on the third day. His arms were still weak, but his eyes were brighter. Nora carried him out of the car, and the moment they stopped in front of the gate, Elliot lifted his head and reached toward the other side of the fence. Arlo, who had been sitting beside Silas, sprang to his feet. No call, no command. Arlo ran to the gate like a quiet gust of wind. He stopped in front of Elliot, touched his nose gently to the boy's hand, then sat and looked up, waiting for a signal. And this time Elliot didn't use signs. He lifted both arms and wrapped them around Arlo's neck. That afternoon, the sea was still. Silas took both of them, Elliot and Arlo, down to the strip of beach behind the house where they used to walk long ago. The rain had just passed, and sunlight broke through, casting long streaks over the wrinkled surface of the ocean. Waves lapped gently. The sand still held warmth from the water. Elliot walked in the center, holding a blue cloth leash loosely wrapped around Arlo, not to restrain him, but simply to stay connected. Arlo walked at his side, never pausing, never veering, his steps landing precisely in Elliot's footprints. Silas followed a few steps behind, carrying the old camera he had once taken across distant mountain ranges in his youth. Just as Elliot and Arlo turned to glance back at him, the sunlight fell upon them, stretching their shadows long across the damp sand. Two silhouettes reunited as if from a lifetime ago. He pressed the shutter. Once. He developed the photograph that night. Under the soft glow of a red light, his hands trembled slightly as the image emerged. Elliot, messy hair, light shirt, a smile still unsure, stood beside Arlo. Dark coat, steady eyes, upright stance, And behind them, two sets of footprints pressed into the wet sand. No edits, no filters, just a moment. But it said more than any words could. The next morning, Silas built the frame by hand. He chose an old slab of oak once used as a school desk, carefully beveling the edges, wiping it clean. After placing the photo in the center, he picked up a brush and with slow, deliberate strokes, wrote across the bottom edge of the frame. Some souls don't need words. They only need to be trusted. Once. He hung the frame on the living room wall, between two sea-facing windows. At noon, sunlight poured in diagonally, touching the glass and casting a soft halo around the two small figures. Nora stopped by that afternoon. When she saw the photo, she stood silently for a long time. Then she turned to Silas, voice hushed and thick. "This isn't just a moment. It's a return." Silas nodded. That night, Elliot went to bed early. Arlo lay at the foot of the bed, his head resting on a small pillow hand-embroidered with two intertwined paw prints, a gift from Nora. Silas sat by the fireplace, rereading the lines he had written in his notebook from a shadow in the back of a kennel. Arlo became a memory etched into the heart of a boy who once had no voice. No one taught him how to love. No one taught Elliot how to trust. But somehow, they found each other and created something wordless, but stronger than any cry. Outside the window, the night wind carried the scent of salt and sea. Silas closed the notebook and looked up at the framed photo on the wall. He didn't speak. He just sat in silence, letting gratitude rise wave by quiet wave. Because some things, just by existing, make the world gentler. Spring returned like a promise, soft but certain. The bare branches by the shore now lowered thin green tendrils toward the ground. In the early morning sunlight filtered through each new leaf, playing over the earth like music written in notes of wind and dew. In the small park at the end of the street, once just a few benches and a weathered oak, 3 figures now sat beneath the spreading canopy. Elliot sat cross-legged, a watercolor palette by his side, brush in hand. On the paper before him, a portrait slowly took shape. A German shepherd head, lifted eyes steady and warm. He didn't speak, but every stroke he laid down was a syllable of the language he had learned from Arlo, a language with no spoken sound, only shared feeling. Silas sat a few steps away, leaning back on a wooden bench, a book open across his knees. But his eyes didn't rest on the page. They lingered on the space between the 2 living beings in front of him, where light fell like a quiet miracle. And at the center of it all, Arlo lay with his side pressed against the grass, chin raised, slightly tongue just peeking out. His eyes followed a butterfly fluttering past. His tail thumped gently against the earth. He didn't bark. He didn't shrink away. He didn't look elsewhere. He lay in the heart of the world, as if that had always been his rightful place. A little girl walked by holding a balloon and tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, that dog." He's smiling. The mother leaned down to look. Arlo, just then sniffing the breeze, narrowed his eyes. The corners of his mouth curled ever so slightly. A real smile. Not because someone had called him, not because he'd been ordered, but because he was fully, quietly alive. Right there among those he loved. The mother nodded. "Yes, sweetie, that dog really is smiling." Silas heard it. He didn't turn around. He just smiled, softly placed his book down on the stone table beside him, and said quietly, as if speaking only to himself but loud enough for Elliot to hear, "He once turned his back on the world. Now he's at the center of it and belongs here." Elliot paused his brush. He looked toward Silas, then back at Arlo, his friend who had once curled in the shadows of a kennel, as silent as a forgotten thought. Now that same dog lay openly beneath the sun, eyes wide and unafraid of anyone passing by. A family strolled through. An old man stopped to pat Arlo's ears. A small boy waved. Arlo didn't move forward, but he didn't move away either. He simply remained, a part of the park as natural as the old oak tree, as gentle as the sky of March. That afternoon, as the sun began to sink lower, Elliot packed up his art supplies. He handed his finished painting to Silas. In the picture, Arlo wasn't lying down. He was standing on the beach. Behind him were footprints, 2 sets pressed into the sand, and above in the sky, 2 swirls of color, blue and gold, just like Arlo's eyes when they caught the light. Silas nodded, saying nothing. He gently pulled Elliot closer and pointed toward Arlo, who was lying stretched out on the grass. He's become a part of your memory. But more importantly, he's living in the present and making us want to live better. Elliot looked at Arlo, then nodded. That evening, when all 3 returned home, Silas hung the new painting beside the old photograph, the one in the wooden frame with that familiar inscription, "Some lives need no voice, just a single moment of trust." And now beside it was a drawing, with no caption, no note, but the light pouring in from the window made both pieces glow in their own way. Arlo lay beneath the wall in his usual spot. Elliot sat beside him, hand resting gently on the dog's back. He gave no sign, and yet Arlo glanced over, as if he understood every tiny motion. From the kitchen, Silas looked through the frame of the doorway, a boy who once never spoke, a dog who used to face the wall. And now, both were facing the world, heads held high. And in that quiet moment, Silas understood. No miracle shines brighter than when a once-forgotten soul is finally seen not by name, but by heart. Perhaps the most beautiful part of Arlo's story wasn't in what he overcame, but in how he stayed. Silently, steadily, lovingly, in the lives of those who once thought they'd live forever in silence and emptiness. A dog once labeled beyond recovery had become a companion, a rescuer, and the keeper of light for a boy who had never uttered a single word. The German Shepherd breed, admired for intelligence, work ethic, and unwavering loyalty, is also known for its depth of heart and spirit that refuses to surrender. Arlo was proof of that even a life once hurt can still become a beacon if shown the right love, and trusted just once. This story also reminds us not all voices come with sound. Sometimes it's a gaze, a quiet nudge, or the simple act of lying beside someone on a cold, windy night that speaks the loudest kind of love. And if you ever find yourself hesitating before a life that's been forgotten, please remember, some dogs need nothing more than a single chance. Just one person with enough patience, a home that doesn't demand, an embrace that leaves space for silences that take time. Because love, with dogs, and especially with German Shepherds, isn't something we teach them. It's something they help us learn again, every single day, through the breath we share.